Hello, you're watching Roundtable. With more than $10 billion raised for Ukraine in just one global fundraiser, that conflict is getting more than just the headlines. It's getting promises of money. And there are warnings that other global humanitarian crises will be neglected. How do you keep up the pressure to help those in need everywhere? Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. While millions remain caught up in conflicts in the global south, to name Ethiopia and the Democratic Republic of Congo as just two, the international community's response to what's happening in Ukraine has been fast and strong. According to Jan Egeland, the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council, leaders need to break the deadlock of indifference towards conflicts in other parts of the world. At the same time, global food prices have soared due to the conflict. How can all global humanitarian crises be treated equally? Okay, let's go first to Paris, and there we see Ole Solvang, Director of Partnerships and Policy at the Norwegian Refugee Council, to Toronto in Canada, and we welcome Nhial Deng, who's a South Sudanese refugee writer and community activist. In Geneva, we find Matt Saltmarsh, Head of News and Media at the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. Nhial, we will get your personal story in just a moment, but I'm going to run through some facts and figures that we picked up on. The UN estimating that 274 million people, that's almost 250 million, are hit by underfunded crisis. They need urgent assistance. Some of the countries, Syria, more than 11 million, Myanmar, 3 million plus, South Sudan, almost 7 million, Burkina Faso, 3 million, and you can add to that list Venezuela, big refugee problem there, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Yemen, where there's been a war for at least 8 years. Ollie, let me come to you first of all. Your boss, Jan Egeland, we quoted him at the very beginning of the program, but he says this is a catastrophe. People will starve. What impact has the crisis in Ukraine had on other trouble spots?
Well, I think that there is no doubt that the needs in Ukraine are very significant, and we need to help them, and we need to have compassion with the suffering that is happening there. But at the same time, we have to make sure that we do not forget all the other crises that are taking place in the rest of the world today. I think you mentioned some very powerful statistics there at the very, very beginning. And the way I see it, there are three ways in which we see that the Ukrainian crisis negatively affect on other crises. One is what you were just alluding to in terms of funding, that there is a lot of funding going to responding to the Ukrainian crisis now, and that is right. But what we're seeing is that this is not additional funding. This is in many cases coming from the humanitarian budgets of the donors already. And it isn't like these other humanitarian crises in the world have gone away, even because Ukraine is there. That's one. A second one is that prices on fuel and food are going up because Ukraine and Russia were some of the main exporters of basic food items, such as wheat, for example. We see this in all the countries where we operate. And thirdly, what we are very worried about is that the tensions that we're now seeing between Russia and the rest of the world will translate into a paralysis of international action on some of the other crises as well. The cross-border resolution on Syria, a UN Security Council resolution allowing for aid to go into Syria from across international borders, for example, was crucial in delivering aid. Is there going to be possible to negotiate such an agreement on a resolution in the UN Security Council going forward? I think that is a very, very big question.
Matt, to you now. The World Food Programme, United Nations World Food Programme, saying it's had to cut by half the amount of food it gives to millions of people in Yemen, Chad, Niger, presumably other countries as well. Is that as a direct result of what we're seeing in Ukraine, or was that already happening?
I think it's probably a confluence of different factors. I mean, we've already heard that prices are rising, inflation is up. And what that effectively means is that if you take $100 million that we might have used in humanitarian aid last year, and we try to implement it this year, it's not going to go nearly as far as it would. So there are, of course, big concerns. I think in terms of Ukraine, what we would say is it's been fantastic that the international community, individuals, governments have been so generous, and rightly so. It's a huge and fast-moving refugee crisis. But we are also concerned about these other countries, and you've mentioned a very long list of them. Most of these countries are chronically underfunded anyway. And if there is aid diversion, humanitarian assistance diversion to Ukraine from those countries, then the situation will be even more chronic. I don't think we're quite at the point of saying, don't fund Ukraine yet. We still haven't quite filled our appeals for Ukraine, but we certainly would be sending the message out. Don't forget all those other crises, particularly in Africa, also, as you mentioned, in Latin America and across in the Middle East and through to Asia as well.
You say you haven't yet asked people to stop funding Ukraine. Is that a possibility?
I don't know if that will happen. There's still, the needs are huge in Ukraine. And we also know that within Ukraine, access to the most affected areas is extremely difficult right now. So if that access opens up, the needs, the amount of people that we can reach will increase. So there will still need to be significant funding and support for Ukraine, certainly in the months ahead, if not for the years ahead. So I don't know if we're going to reach that position, but it may be that there comes a point when we say, let's start thinking harder about these other places and let's try to get more assistance to those places.
Okay, understand. Nhial, your personal story in a little bit of detail in just a moment, but responding to what Matt and Ole have just said, do you see this in a sense as the first world looking after its own rather than those people elsewhere, that their problem has perhaps been pushed to one side because people want to take after problems in Europe rather than, let's say, in Africa?
Yes, I think that is what we have been seeing the crisis in Ukraine is that we've seen the world attention all goes to Ukraine, another conflict, and crises across the world are being neglected. And I think, as both speakers said, I think it's important that the people fleeing Ukraine are assisted. People should respond to them as compassionate, we have seen. But at the same time, it's very crucial that we also support those who are fleeing other conflict, those who are already in crisis. As I shared my story, I was in Kakuma refugee camp for 11 years. It's a camp of more than 200,000 people. And there's just a lot of other crises across the world where people need the same support and the same compassion as well.
So you were in South Sudan. I understand you then went to Ethiopia. Do you think the problems in those countries in the years that have intervened since you were there have improved at all because of the assistance the people there have been getting, or have things just been left effectively to tread water?
I don't think there's been an improvement. As I said in my story, my family has been affected by war intergenerationally. I was born and raised in Ethiopia, where my father settled after fleeing the first Sudanese civil war more than 5 decades ago. And then 11 years ago, my village in Ethiopia was attacked. And then I fled to Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, where I spent the last 11 years of my life. And so, as you can see, my father first fled more than 5 decades ago. And then 10 years later, I had to flee again. And then 11 years later, my whole family are still refugees. So I will not say there's been an improvement at all. And I think we've seen the same thing happening all through all these decades. There's been neglect. These countries are receiving no attention at all.
Nhial, thank you very much indeed. The refugee camp in Kenya that you refer to, I think, is probably the biggest there is in the world. Ole, it's damning, isn't it, to hear somebody like Nhial say that over the years there has effectively been no real change, that what you're doing, all of those of you who want to try and help, is actually just providing assistance, the status quo, if you like, so that people can survive rather than see their lives improve. Therefore, my question is what is happening in Ukraine actually making any difference to what's happening elsewhere, or was it always going to be pretty poor in those other countries?
Well, I think coming back to one point that I made a little bit earlier, the fact that we have this major crisis in Ukraine, in Europe, hasn't made the situation in the rest of the world any better. And in many places, things are really, really bad. We have drought in Somalia, in Western Sahel. You have millions of people who are on the verge of famine in many places around the world. And at the same time, I think there's a point here that we have to get better at providing durable solutions for people, at looking at sort of longer term programming to help people to become more self-reliant. And there are several elements to that. Some elements is in the way that we do programming. One of the important things that we do at NRC, at the Norwegian Refugee Council, for example, is we're trying to ensure that people have the documents that they need, identity documents that they have, documents to prove housing, land, and property rights, because in many cases those are key documents to be able to start a business. I remember I visited Kakuma camp a couple of years ago, and one of the things we were working on there was giving people work permit, making sure that people in those camps had work permits so they could help work themselves out of into a more durable solutions. So we have to look sort of at a longer-term programming and for longer-term solutions.
Okay, I'm going to ask Nhial in just a moment whether, in fact, that sort of assistance you felt was available where you were. But Matt, let me come to you. One of the things that you've said is we need to try to focus on crises elsewhere. How do you get people to change where they're looking?
It's not at all easy to do that. I mean, I think part of that comes down to the media and media coverage. And we do know that there is a direct correlation between media coverage, increased coverage, and increased donations. We saw that last year with Afghanistan, and we've certainly seen that in spades this year with Ukraine. So I think that could help. I mean, I think also the humanitarian community, the development community, we do try and focus on less developed regions, less wealthy regions. There has been a big push in recent years for the two to try to come together. So that the development side, the longer term side, goes hand in hand with the humanitarian side. The humanitarian side really should be about emergencies and emergency relief. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is it's becoming much more of a staple. People are becoming much more reliant on humanitarian support. And that's not a positive thing. We always talk about the root causes of refugee movements and of the movement of economic migrants. And unfortunately, we haven't seen progress on those factors. We've mentioned climate change, but obviously there's war, persecution, and on the economic side, there's now inflation and there's a downturn. So none of these factors appear to be improving. And of course, the situation in Ukraine has made our world even less stable in many ways. But just a final note, we don't want to be completely pessimistic here. There have been some positives, particularly from the private sector, the outreach from individuals. People know much more about the refugee situation now. And we have something called the Global Compact on Refugees. And we'll be working on that. We are working on that with a lot of different actors on this question of solutions. And hopefully, Ukraine notwithstanding, we can start to make some good progress and harness that energy and activism that we have seen come out of the Ukraine situation.
Nhial, we were hearing from Ole about some of the things that he would hope to see introduced in the camps where you were and other places as well. But if there is no real progress in the eyes of people such as yourself, are people likely to be unwilling to give as much as they perhaps have done in the past? Do we not need to see more everyday progress made?
Yeah, no, I think coming to the point that he was talking about, I think it's important, including what Matt just said, that, the development side and the humanitarian side needs to come together. I think we need to move away from just giving people aid and handout to looking at how people can sustain themselves, how people can be self-reliant. I think doing things like giving people work permit is a very important thing. In place like Kenya, for example, refugees don't have the right to work. So it's become very challenging for them to be able to be self-reliant. So I think looking at those angle and those perspectives and saying we have to move away from just giving people aid and looking at how people can be stabilized and rebuild their life. I think it's a very important angle to look at it from.
Can we come back to the day-to-day emergencies? We know what's happening in Ukraine by and large, but in other countries where there are crises, there's a severe lack of food, has been for a long time. We've heard about droughts. And this is from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. The ban on exports, that is from Russia, and the increased needs in Ukraine have serious implications for humanitarian food supplies. Before the war, the global humanitarian system relied on the country, Ukraine that is, as one of the main suppliers of food. World Food Programme used to buy half its wheat from Ukraine for food assistance, including in-kind distributions. Nhial, what kind of impact is that going to have on people who were already short of enough to eat?
I think as we've seen, or as we know, Ukraine and Russia provide most of the food to countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and that means with the current crisis, that export is going to stop, and that means more people will have no access to food. We've seen already the impact, for example, in a country like Somalia, where there's famine that has forced millions into the brink of starvation. I think, this has affected countries a lot.
Matt, back to you quickly on the question of money. In March, I think it was, maybe it was a little bit earlier, you'll tell me, there was what you called a flash appeal for $41 billion. Did that money come in, or was it just promises? And if it did come in, how much difference will it make?
You're talking about the Ukraine situation appeal here?
I'm talking about what the general appeal for $41 billion, which I thought was pre the war in Ukraine.
Well, I mean, what we've seen is throughout the course of the year, the appeals for different countries, different situations are funded to different degrees. In March, we put out an appeal with partners for Ukraine, and that was for the refugee response. That was for 550 or so million, and that's 81% funded. Different situations have different levels of funding. Afghanistan is much lower, but we've just seen a pledging conference there, so it did increase somewhat. But then if we come back to those countries that we mentioned at the top of the show, places in the Sahel, Chad situation, northern Cameroon, across to Iraq, the Middle East, Myanmar, those situations are struggling, and we're not seeing nearly as much money come in there proportionately. But we do hope more will come in.
But promises of money or real hard cash?
Well, often you get promises of money and the real hard cash comes quite a lot later in the day.
Well, in reality, sometimes it doesn't come at all. It's just a promise.
And sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it doesn't come at all. But we're not yet halfway through the year. So I think we would probably take more of a view of this after the summer, when we get into the autumn, and we have a better view on the global level of funding that we're seeing.
Okay, Ole, this 41 million that I mentioned, not part of the Ukrainian appeal, but for other crises elsewhere, it's less than 1/10 of what was promised for Ukraine. A, that's pitiful in its own way. But secondly, has the money arrived? Did it make any difference? Will it make any difference?
Well, I think, all the funding will make a difference. And it's correct, as you say, these pledges that come in, sometimes they do not come in at all. Another element here that it's important that this money that comes in is used very efficiently, and that it gets to the frontline responders very quickly. And that could be, for example, going to local organizations as well, which is very important. So, I mean, listen, what is really important here is that we take some of the lessons that we're seeing from the Ukraine response, where we've seen tremendous outpouring of goodwill, where we've seen that countries can respond very quickly, both in terms of finding funding and in terms of allowing people to flee to safety, etc. And that we take some of those lessons and we try to apply them to all the other conflicts in the world that has gotten less attention and is getting less attention now. The Norwegian Refugee Council each year publishes an annual list of the most neglected crises in the world. The DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, topped that list last year, and it will be up there again this year. We don't hear anything about that. but there are thousands and thousands of people who are being displaced. There's an active wars going on there. We need to be able to extend our empathy to those people as well.
Nhial, one of the problems, and Matt alluded to it, is that organisations that try to help in these situations are under pressures themselves, that they don't have the same resources that they had because, A, people aren't necessarily giving the right amount of money in the right place, but also because of inflationary pressures. Things are costing a great deal more. The amount that can be bought is smaller than it was 12, 15 months ago. Do you see any way of solving that problem?
I think it's a very complicated problem to try to solve. But look, our world general, I think we have more than enough food to feed everyone. I think we have more than enough resources for everyone in the world. I think things are just not being divided equally. So I think we need the political will. We need cooperation to come together. We need businesses to come together. I think for us to be able to solve all these crises, we need every single person to be able to contribute because we need much more a global response than just a regional response or a country-focused response, because all these crises will affect each and every single country in one way or the other.
Okay, Matt Saltmarsh, is that at all possible, a global response to something like this? There is more than enough food to go around. Nhial's not the only one to say it, that if we actually harvested everything properly, everybody could eat extremely well. How do you see, if it is at all possible, any kind of global response being put together?
Well, I think the only way is for countries to come together through the United Nations, through international fora, through other international organizations, and to cooperate and to find solutions and to do that work that we talked about, that long-term development work, which is very hard and it takes years and years of investment, coupled with private sector investment, of course, is very important, and then also the humanitarian aid. I think the other thing I would add, aside from the financing, which we've talked a lot about, is also people's mindset towards refugees. I think it's very important that this spirit of welcome that we've seen with the Ukraine does endure, because we know that in the lead up to the Ukraine crisis, there was an increasing number of incidents around xenophobia, tension, hate speech towards outsiders and refugees. And we would really hope that this crisis can help the understanding of refugees and their plight. And to Nhial's point earlier, to help mobilize people, to help refugees to become independent actors so that they can rebuild their lives and integrate wherever they are, or return if that's possible and if that's their choice. And that would be something potentially positive that might come out of this crisis in the longer term.
I don't want to sound too cynical. I'll come to you first on this one, Ole, then to you, Nhial. But isn't the sad fact that we've got a Ukraine at the moment mean that next time there'll be another one that takes the attention away from the problems in other corners of the world? There's always something stopping people being able to give or concentrate on those areas that you think are absolutely vital.
Well, I mean, you are right that we tend to have short attention spans, and media as well, I think, is sometimes a contributor to that. But that's why we're here, and that's why this topic is so important, to try to focus on those crises that do not necessarily that are not necessarily in the media headlines right now. And I think that is incredibly important, and that puts things in perspective. And we have to be able to have several crises in our heads at the same time here and be able to respond to them at the same time.
Nhial, you've got people out there who might be interested, but their attention is always being drawn elsewhere. That's always going to happen, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there's just a lot of things happening across the world that make people forget crisis easily. But I think one thing I would agree with, as Matt said, is that people are now hopefully will have a positive response to our refugees, and even the term refugees, how people interact with it. Before, it was almost a taboo to say it. It was almost a taboo to be a refugee. You would introduce yourself and people will look at you differently. But I hope that will change right now, that people have seen that no one chooses to be a refugee and it could happen to anyone anywhere. And I hope, that will change, how people interact with refugees in the future.
Listen, many thanks, Ole, Nhial, and Matt. Much appreciate you taking the time, and good luck with everything you are trying to achieve. I will end this by saying one thing that Antonio Guterres, UN Secretary General, has put out there that illustrates how difficult it is to get people to commit. He was talking about Afghanistan, where, according to him, people are selling their children and their body parts to raise enough money to feed the rest of their families. He asked for urgent money to be sent in. He got half of what he asked for. In Yemen, it was just 1/3. How do we change that? That's one of the things we've been trying to think about here on Roundtable. From me, David Foster, from the team, from my guests, thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.